lesson of resilience that was occurring at this point in time of how that can contribute to healthy rural communities, what communities need to do to get through these kinds of tragedies and lead to better outcomes. And today, my presentation and our discussion will focus on healthy rural communities and how we might approach that. With that in mind, there is a order to what we'll try to do. I'll go through issues impacting rural communities, overview the Healthy Rural Communities Toolkit. We'll talk about health indicators. And then what I really want to bring focus to are some of the innovative practices, and we'll hear from our guests and our panelists in that regard as we go through the session. Just at the outset, to acknowledge the funding from Public Health Ontario, the thanks to them as part of the locally driven collaborative projects program, the funding from OMAFRA through the University of Guelph OMAFRA partnership, and also contributions from many health units and from many members of OPPI, which is the Ontario Professional Planners Institute, in terms of contributing to the content of the Healthy Rural Communities Toolkit. So I'm going to engage our panel right at the outset, and not sure if Glenn is with us at the moment, but Glenn McNeil, a shout out to you if you're there. And I'm going to share a few slides, and we're going to go through this fairly quickly. And I'm just going to ask our panel members to shout out 1 or 2 word answers, and you want to make sure that your microphone is turned back on. And just as these slides come up, I would normally do this with an entire audience, but it's kind of hard to do that in our current situation. So let's see some of these pictures and what they might tell us about healthy rural communities, what images might come to your mind, and just shout out.
Transportation.
Transportation, absolutely.
Multimodal.
What was that?
Multimodal.
Multimodal. I thought you said quasi-modal for a second. I was glad it was multimodal. George, what comes to your mind?
Built environment.
The built environment, absolutely. And Glenn, not sure if you're there, if you can hear us. If you are, might still be connecting. But those
Glenn
are
is not here yet.
Okay. Any other images or words that come to mind as you look at those slides?
Options.
Options.
Places to go
Places
or not to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's some more slides just to reflect on. Some of them local to the Huron County area, some from further afield.
Ecosystem services.
Ecosystem services, excellent. By that, Regan, you're reflecting on?
Recreational space, resources for building supplies, cultural heritage resources, all of the different ecosystem services.
Good stuff.
Associated with natural areas.
Good stuff.
I saw life experiences.
Pardon, George?
Life experiences.
Life experiences, certainly, yes. Laura, anything else coming to your mind?
I think about the stairs, and I see that's a nice railing and a good contrast between the stairs. I have a background in fall prevention as well, so this is probably a healthcare setting. The green space there also contributes to health. But some of the other ones, I'm like, I don't know what to think about that. I don't know what those, brains, I don't know what kind of geographical, logical picture that is.
Well, those are all great comments. Folks, let's look at, we have 2 more sets of these slides. Any key words that come to mind?
Activities.
Activities, absolutely.
Green spaces and
Green spaces.
sun protection and shade.
Yeah, absolutely.
Change, maybe? Change in change?
Change, yes. In what regard are you thinking of that?
Well, like in terms of aging population change, in terms of labor shortages change. On the right-hand side, maybe looking at the vulnerability of ecosystems. I'm not sure about the bottom right in terms of change, but technology maybe, and how technology is changing agricultural practices.
Well, I can say how much that is different than the farm I grew up on many years ago near Blythe. So let's look at one final set of slides and let's look for some more keywords.
Community,
Certainly.
togetherness,
Teamwork.
Teamwork.
Pace.
Pace.
Space.
Base, yeah. And just want to elaborate upon that a little bit, George, what you're thinking of when you say that?
The expansiveness of the rural environment, open space.
Yeah, very, very true. And if you think of that road that we're seeing in that top right photo as an example, comparing that to when we often talk about the built environment, we're thinking of more urban spaces often and how different that is there. So thanks. Those are great, great comments. So thanks to our panel for those. And when I reflect on them, and I think these were embedded in what our panelists were saying as well, there are three key aspects of it. You know, I see the economic, I see the environmental, and I see the social wrapped up in all of those prior images. And for me, that talks about sustainability and, of course, the relationship to healthy rural communities. And by sustainability meaning how do we get to the future? How do we make sure that the next generation has at least as much as we do, and that it's done in a way that creates a healthy environment that works for people and for the environment itself? Much of my research is focused on looking at things such as trends, critical events, and scenarios. And this initial slide, if you look at the left, it's gauging impact, and that can be defined in many, many kinds of ways. It's looking at time, and it's looking at the trend lines that take us from point A to point B in time. And then it reflects on a critical event that comes along that changes that trend line. Well, folks, of course, we're living in the middle of one of those right now, but we can look back in time to the high interest rates of the early 1980s and what that did for many people in their lives. We can certainly look at the future in terms of climate change as an example. But the question is then, what do these impacts do to us in terms of those trend lines? And if we look at COVID as an example, we can forecast that there are businesses and industries out there that will prosper as a result of COVID, and there are those that will change permanently and significantly. And there will be others which over time get back into a fairly similar vein that they were in previously. So this whole issue of what is that critical event and how does that impact us, I think is really quite critical. And it speaks to how municipalities and communities are able to react to change and make things more positive into the future. So I pose this question again, normally to audiences where I've got many people that contribute. So I'll invite people to think about this, and I'll share with you the results from previously posing this question. But what trends or issues do you think may fundamentally impact rural Ontario? I invite people to think long-term. You might want to put comments into the discussion post if you choose to, into the chat box. But these are the kinds of answers that I've received from people to this question historically. And they range from things such as the impacts in education and how that's changing with time, to infrastructure and leadership and how that's changing at the top of that graph, down to healthy populations in the bottom right. And these 18 evolving rural issues change over time. COVID's not here. Hopefully it's a one-time thing, but will have lasting implications for sure. But the question is, how do we think about these kinds of things? And it starts with the recognition that there's a range of issues confronting Ontario's rural communities, and there's a relationship between each of these issues in one way or the other that impacts all of us in the lives that we lead. So as we start to think about this in the context of healthy rural communities, we started in our research by looking at the relationship between the built environment and health. And George is a recognized expert in this area in terms of the built environment. And you can look at it with a rural lens, and you can look at it with an urban lens. And I think it would be fair to say that it primarily in the past has had an urban lens. And what we want to do is to bring a rural perspective to it. And we start thinking about things such as the built environment in terms of obesity and physical inactivity, chronic diseases, climate change, and so on. And all of those activities are part of what we need to be thinking about. And it draws on this particular slide, which provides us with key health indices contrasting rural versus urban. As we look at the urban, it's in orange. And if we look at the blue, it's rural. And what we can see is that rural communities, and this was a surprise to me when I first came away with this understanding, is that rural communities tend to have poorer health than urban communities. And it's measured in a number of things. We have in rural communities more obese people, as an example. We have higher incidences of heavy drinking. We have more asthma, more diabetes. We have higher proportion of people that smoke and so on. And all of these things contribute to why we need to think about it from my perspective in terms of a rural perspective, that there really are some key issues that impact rural communities that deserve our attention. So coming back to that list of 18 evolving issues, it's to acknowledge that while there is a relationship between healthy rural communities and the built environment, there are many other issues to be tackled, ranging from poverty to depopulation. And again, in my view, it's this notion of a broad-based perspective on what is a healthy rural community and how do we achieve it. And it's about much more than the built environment, but includes all of these other things in my view as well. So just to bring a little bit of focus to a couple of them that I highlighted earlier, demographic shifts being a key aspect of that. And I'm always taken by these next two slides. So this is a slide demonstrating the population pyramid from 1971 and of the Canadian population. And many of you will be familiar with population pyramids. For those of you who are not, what we have, and I think you can hopefully see my cursor on the screen. You can see in blue on the left-hand side, the male population, and on the right-hand side, the female population, and you can see the various age cohorts. So in 1971, the largest cohort was in the age of 10 to 14, representing between 5 and 6% of the total population on the male side and similar on the female side. 1971, remember what that pyramid looks like. Let's jump ahead to 2021, and you can see how radically different it has changed. 1971, we have the baby boom population starting to move through as a very distinct cohort. And by and we have a very young population as a country. When we go to 2021, you can see that we're increasingly older. And as a population, as a country, we have a high proportion of people moving into that older contribution. Those folks who were in the largest age group in 1971, if I did my math right, which should be 50 years, would be now in the 60 to 64 age range. And you can see what's happening. When you look at rural communities, it's even more exacerbated. And let's look at the next slide just to demonstrate that. This is population change between 2011 and 2016. And if you're in the dark blue / purple in the GTA area, you can see the incredible growth that is happening there, growing by more than 10%. Whereas over that 5-year time period, probably much more than that in some of these areas. And you can see the blue with the population change of between 0 and 10%. And you can see the light orange and the dark orange, which is actually more so in Northern Ontario, though we have a little touch of it right here, where there actually is a loss of population. And that includes many communities in Huron and in Lambton and Essex and Elgin and so on. And certainly as you get into Northern Ontario, much higher proportions. So this change is fairly easy to understand. It's simply a function of birth rates and death rates, outmigration, and a relative lack of immigration coming into rural communities, helping to explain that. And if we look at the time period, this is forecast by the Ontario Ministry of Finance, going out from 2013 to 2041. And keep in mind, these are only forecasts based on certain variables, but you can see that there are areas of the province, perhaps even some of our own communities that we might live in, which are forecast to see a loss of population over that period of time. Again, relatively simple to understand: birth rates, death rates, outmigration, and a relative lack of in-migration. And some of those things can potentially change, which makes immigration so important for those communities that are potentially in a declining mode in terms of moving forward. These are really important to think about when we think about healthy rural communities, because in my view, a healthy rural community has a sustained population, and that's something that one might aim to encourage. So when we think about some of these trends that are happening globally, some of them are regional, some are local, I often think, well, how do we respond to those? And there will be times when we will look to the federal government or we will look to the provincial government. But for most of us on the call today, all that we can really control is what happens in our own communities. What are the things that we might do in the municipalities or the communities that we live in, which speaks to this notion of a community-based response. So that led us to do work looking at healthy rural communities, and in particular to pull together the manual, which is on the right-hand side. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. This material is all available online at www.ruralhealthycommunities.ca. There's a whole series of interviews with community members, with Dr. Charles Gardner from Simcoe Health Unit, with George McKibbon, who's with us today as a planner, and many other people who have contributed as well. So I encourage you to have a look at that if you're further interested in the topic. But in particular, if we look at low birth rates, what I mentioned earlier, an aging population, an urban focused immigration, most of the immigrants who move to this province end up in the large cities. What does this mean for rural Ontario? And it's to speak to the importance of, I mentioned immigration as well, importance of community economic development, all as drivers to help achieve a healthy community, along with all of the anticipated health outcomes as well. So the toolkit identified 13 key actions. I'm not going to go over them in a lot of detail right now. I'm going to save that for a discussion with our panel. And in particular, you will see though that they range from, and I just need to adjust my screen at this end a little bit, they range all the way from how do we respond to climate change? And those communities that we identified that we viewed as being most successful were in the process of making a good response to climate change. They were looking at community design and land use planning. They were building options related to active transportation. They were focused on water and air quality. They were thinking about tourism as a key economic driver and what that does for communities as well. They had put thought into special age populations, special age groups, the youth and the elderly. How do we make sure that we have good opportunities for those? And within the toolkit, there are examples of communities that have done that well. We're thinking about agriculture, and no better place to think about agriculture than looking out my window right here and to see the bounty of rural Huron County, right, and the agricultural footprint that exists here. And good things were happening there, partially connected to local food and others as well. But cultural strategies were being championed. There was certainly a response to nature. And we're hearing so much about affordable housing today. And that's certainly a focus that many communities had. And these are all examples of things that can be done to achieve healthy rural communities. So with that, I'm just going to slip to the next slide. I'm going to invite our panel, again, adjust my screen a little bit here, to reflect on these themes and to invite our panel to share some examples with us. And the first one, bringing a little bit more focus to communities design, land use planning, community engagement, or active transportation. And I will just ask, Glenn, are you with us now? Maybe he's not able to make the connection, and I'm sure Jay's in the background trying to work that out. But so these are the three topics to start with, and I think they're pretty intuitively understood in terms of what we're talking about. But do we have some examples from our panelists that they would be willing to share? And maybe we'll get 2 or 3 examples for this particular slide. So I see everybody has their microphone unmuted, so that's a good sign. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first. I would like to talk about Clean Air Hamilton, which is a stakeholders group that's been in place for over 25 years. It was initially started by the Ministry of the Environment staff with the region of Hamilton Wentworth, and it was intended to deal with industrial toxics because Hamilton is a steel town, industrial town, and that's a big issue. But when they spoke to medical and public health officials at McMaster University, they realized they had to expand and change their focus and focus on health outcomes, hospitalizations, and mortalities that result from poor air quality days. And that began a 25-year odyssey, if you like, which involved stakeholders from industry, community groups, academia, the professions, and the provincial and federal governments in dealing with matters of air quality and the sources of air quality. And that sort of culminated last week on Tuesday with a session like this, in which the results of an air quality model for the city of Hamilton were discussed. And one could see from the model contributions geographically throughout the rural area, the urban area, and almost down to a neighborhood level of all the various contaminants, transboundary migration, and the like. And one could see it in terms of 6 pollutants that were specifically related to hospitalizations, the rate of hospitalizations and mortalities during poor air quality days. That's a kind of an example that sort of, it's a voluntary stakeholders group, involved a lot of people, some of whom didn't agree with each other on various issues, neighborhoods that, you know, and rural areas as rural communities as well. So you have engagement. You also have emphasis on active transportation, because one of the things we learned is that, you know, we think of air pollution, we think of industry, we don't think of tailpipe emissions. Whereas 400 series highways and some of our highways and arterials are significant contributors of contaminants. And so the encouragement of active transportation, in addition to other health benefits, was integrally related to the question of how do you reduce tailpipe emissions. And that gets into the question of land use planning. How do you separate sources like highways and industries from sensitive uses like houses, schools, and uses like that? And those are things that had to be correlated with the different methods by which permits are issued under the Environmental Protection Act. So that's a kind of an example of sort of innovative work. It starts with a very simple question, but as people become involved and from different perspectives and work together in a collaborative setting, it leads them into journeys they never imagined that they would ever end up taking.
That's a fantastic example. Thanks, George. And I know for those of us who visit Hamilton, it's been really quite remarkable to watch the transition that's going on in terms of air quality and so on. And I just know that some of the work I've done in the Hamilton area, the Coutts to Escarpment area, just a pristine environment that certainly steps outside of the stereotype of what people think about Hamilton, and much of that driven by community engagement and the work that people have done. So thank you for that. Laura or Regan, an example you might have?
Yeah, I know in terms of community engagement, a project that comes to mind is called Destination Prosperity. And that's where we've hired a community developer to work with populations and communities. I think it always starts with women and to identify how the community can serve them better. And so these are they're usually people who aren't already currently engaged in their community, because there's lots of times organizations put out the opportunity for community engagement, and you see people who are well connected and really great advocates or used to having their opinions heard volunteer to inform that. So this is a really great way to help other communities mobilize and respond to those opportunities. So I know with some of the groups, some of those land use planning and rezoning things have come up, and now those groups kind of have they're mobilized and they have more confidence to be able to speak to them and have been able to inform some of those decisions. So I think that's been a great project that I hope continues. It's happened through United Way funding. And I know there's a lot of work in every community being done with community safety and well-being plans. And I think that could be a big outcome of that, is trying to engage with some of those communities that don't necessarily volunteer or maybe have had bad experiences in the past with trying to be involved. So hopefully we see some more community development and mobilization happening on some of these.
I'm also hearing that the importance of partnerships. You mentioned the United Way and the role that they play, and other organizations that would be party to that too. So it's really also a key aspect of it, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. Regan, do you have an example to share?
I do, and it kind of ties to your next slide too. So it could be for both.
Why don't I jump ahead to the next slide then, and just in the interest of time, and that will help us get through things. So the next slide is water and air quality, and certainly that picks up on what George was talking about too, agriculture or access to local food, and all of these being key elements of a healthy rural community. Those communities that are addressing these kinds of things in a positive way, good outcomes can happen. So Regan?
Yeah, so I was going to talk about Dufferin County. Out of COVID-19, they started hosting agricultural roundtables. And this was an initiative to bring together the agricultural community, but also connect them to consumers. So they host two different types of roundtables, they're called. One that's focused on business to business and one that's business to consumer. And then from that, there's been a series of initiatives around how to apply to grants, how to connect consumers to agricultural businesses, what are the best platforms, whether it be Instagram or Facebook, and identifying resources within the community where different members can help out agricultural businesses get connected to their consumers. And that's just a really neat way that community engagement, agriculture, access to local food has all come together. And another piece of that is there was a campaign they launched where they were promoting that you could work on farms. So it was "You Can Work Here," and they had a series of signs posted on agricultural land that said you can work here, like this is a place that you could be employed. And that was kind of addressing unemployment, but also shortages in the agricultural system.
Good stuff. Another word, as I was listening to you, that came to mind is this whole notion of localization. You were saying about business to business, and building on the capacity that exists within the community, which I think is really a helpful perspective as we think about agriculture and local food. Good stuff. Thank you for that. George or Laura, an example that might come to your mind that captures any of these headings?
A quick one. First of all, when we think of watershed, we think of water, we think of watersheds and conservation authorities. When we think of air quality, we don't think of airsheds. And the one thing I would like to encourage the listeners to begin to think about in terms of innovation, looking at air quality from the perspective of an airshed. And that has been one of the, over the 25 years of Clean Air Hamilton, that has been one of the endeavors that we've tried to do to manage the airshed of the city of Hamilton, as opposed to just managing air quality through licensing of industrial facilities.
That's a good point. And I think airsheds existing locally. I'm also reflecting on last year, about a year ago now, how clean the air seemed in Southern Ontario because of the impact that we were feeling from the large airshed, which would have otherwise included the American Midwest and the contaminants that we would sometimes have as a result of that. So thank you for that, George. And Laura, do you want to jump in on this one, or will we go to the next slide?
I think we can go to the next one.
All right, let's go to the next slide and see what we have. So the next slide is 4 topics that are flagged as part of healthy rural communities. And I should just point out that on the right-hand side, hopefully people can see it. This is how the manual is organized. You can see action 6 is around tourism. Why is tourism important? What did we learn from the research, from the literature? Then we've got some case studies, and then recommendations for rural municipalities, and then other resources. And there's more content within the manual beyond this, but that's essentially how it's organized. So here we have the topics of tourism, cultural strategies, or nature, or climate change. And do we have any innovative examples or successes to share? And Laura, I don't know if you have one that fits in under any of these headings.
Pass.
Okay. Perfect. Regan or George?
Yeah, I have an example, actually 2, around tree planting initiatives. So looking at Wellington's Green Legacy program, and Clarington also has a Trees for Rural Roads program. And both of those initiatives are focused around tree planting. In Clarington, it's along rural roads specifically. In Wellington, it's anywhere within the county. And both programs offer free trees to community members to plant. And it's kind of this community engagement initiative along with the ecosystem service benefits that come with it. So climate regulation, water management, all of those sorts of things as well.
Good stuff.
And actually, Wellington County's Green Legacy program was recognized by the UN Billion Tree Campaign, which is really neat. And so there's a few different documentaries about them.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it? Tree planting is one of my favorite topics, and it addresses so much nature and climate change. And for example, in Huron, it also comes back to that partnership, the role of conservation authorities, as an example, the role of county government, the role of local municipalities, and many, many not-for-profit organizations that are stressing that as too. So thank you for that example. George?
I was hesitating to talk about an experience I had 10 years ago working in Cali, Colombia in South America, looking at recreational facilities for a recreational provider there. I was a subcontractor. And it involved taking some of the ideas that Kevin Lynch and Donald Applegard, 2 professors from MIT, took on how to experience the environment. And when you think of the environment, you think of how you move through it, how you visualize it, how you create boundaries and experience it. And I think that when you think of tourism, cultural strategies, nature, and climate change, those kinds of strategies become really important to think about and to work with in order, particularly during a pandemic, when we're trying to move to a different way of understanding how we move and experience the environment we live in.
And again, to add to that, it speaks as well, the research that's been done looking at the role of the environment and healthy mental health or good mental health, right? And the connections that exist there, which I think both of those 2 examples speak to. Anyone else, anything else in this slide? If not, I'll jump to the next one. Okay, and the next one is planning for special age groups or safe and affordable housing, which again is a really key a couple of topic areas, and they're certainly related as many are as well. So anybody have an example they would like to share connected to either of these two topics?
The work that volunteer work I did in Hamilton again with Vision 2020, 98, 99 involved interviewing the public and characterizing how they characterize the environment through questionnaires and the like. At one point, we realized that not everybody experiences the environment in that sort of general fashion. So we broke out a set of interviews with groups that were special, homeless kids, refugees, single parent moms with children, other groups that had special challenges, and put to them questions that were particular to their life experience. Like, how would the quality of how can we help you improve the quality of your life? So I think it's important to think of, when we think of special age groups and we think of some of the outcomes like affordable and safe housing, to also address the emotional content that is involved with the participants with whom we're trying to help. And I think as planners, it's really important to really think carefully about what is help, how do planners help, and the role of silence and listening in both those activities.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting, I think, to have safe and affordable housing as one of the topics, and we're seeing affordable housing profiled across many rural communities these days. But I've come to appreciate over my career that if you're in an urban context and you see someone who's homeless, you see it. It's visible. And yet, in many rural communities, I think there are people living in substandard housing, and it's not so visible, and it's easy to not recognize it, even though it might be quite prevalent and quite present. So
I did want to add another point too, that there's an interconnection where homelessness is concerned between folks in the city and folks in rural communities. For example, here in Port Colborne, it's not uncommon to meet folk who are homeless who have also gone through the homeless system in St. Catharines and the city of Hamilton, and maybe even Toronto. And when you look at those kind of problems, that those problems are pervasive. They affect members of our communities that live in very different environments, and we need to think about that.
Good stuff. Thank you for that, George. Another example, Laura?
I mean, both those categories are like really hit. Like, yeah, the things need to be done, and things are being done, but it still feels like a long way to go on both those topics. So I don't have any specific inspiring example, but I know there has been a lot of work done recently, a lot more being done on those topics, and I really hope to see them continue to develop, especially now when the bad things that can happen in some of these congregate settings when it comes to infectious diseases, both for older adults and for younger adults. It just makes things very easy to spread. I would love to see big system changes on these issues, but don't have the inspiring story to go along with it.
It's very fine. It really brings to focus the social indicators of health, though, doesn't it? In terms of how everything is interconnected, right? That health outcomes, boy, it's tough to have good health outcomes if you're living in compromised housing, as an example. We think of planning for special age groups and how we might deal with that. And maybe I'll let Regan go in case I take something that she might have been otherwise wanting to say, but she's saying, no, I can speak, I think. So it's this notion of, people say, well, if you plan for, what is it, under 5 and over 80, if I got the right saying there?
Oh, 8 to 80.
8 to 80, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If you do that, then you've probably captured everyone in the middle. But if you really think about the needs of people who are elderly and the people who are very young, and make decisions around that, you can probably contribute positively to good outcomes. Regan, anything you'd like to add to this slide? No?
No, not for this one.
Okay, well, let me move along then. We're going to have an opportunity to come back to more examples, but we wanted to structure this in a way that helped people to see the key themes through your eyes as it relates to some of the specific examples that we have there. And just wanting to offer a final reflection as part of my presentation, and then we'll go to some questions for the panel. And this final reflection is on the village of Blythe. And I have to say, folks, if you haven't gathered already, I have a soft spot for the village of Blythe. I went to school there and was raised on a farm just outside of Blythe. And for me, it's been interesting to watch Blythe over the years go through transition as it has. And right now, for example, in that slide, we're looking at the theater or the festival, the memorial that was built to folks following the First World War, and that living memorial and how it's contributed over time, I think, to a healthy rural community. And what I want to focus on is something that happened more recently, and this was before COVID hit us. So this is going back a year and a half or thereabouts ago. And one of my students, Rana Telfa, who's on the right-hand side, there was a desire on the part of folks within the village to organize a dinner that was focused on Syrian food as a way of acknowledging and recognizing the transition that people need to go through as it relates to recognition and welcoming communities in terms of refugees and so on. And I should say that Rana's research is focused on the challenges Syrian refugees have faced in rural Ontario. But what really captured me was this village of 1,000 people welcoming a number of individuals to come into the community and put on a dinner. And they sold out, I think it was 150 tickets thereabouts, which were sold, all to experience Syrian food. But for me, it was much more than that. It was this notion of welcoming, this notion of accepting that change is about to happen, and particularly for rural communities that want to sustain their population, this need to be more welcoming of immigrants, as an example, and what that will do for sustaining the population of this community and contributing to healthy outcomes. So for me, it's related to culture, it's related to acceptance, it's related to resilience within this community as well. And I just thought that was a fine example to conclude with. I will mention that on my website, you can find access to the Healthy Rural Communities Toolkit, waynecaldwell.ca, lots of materials on immigration, references to books on, including one on planning for rural resilience. This book also I drew on today, Rural Community Economic Development, and a number of guides and manuals that are there freely for people to download if they're interested. So that's there as resource materials. And with that, I would like to say thanks to the audience for listening to the presentation and the discussions that we've had to this point in time. I'm going to stop screen share in a moment and engage our panel with 2 or 3 questions that we've thought about in advance. The third question really just takes us back to more examples along the lines of what we've heard already. So let me stop sharing my screen, and I'll invite folks to get involved. And I have to go check my notes. What was my first question, which was, from your perspective, what makes a healthy community? And we've already heard some of your answers to that in the examples that you've provided, but interested in anything else that you might want to offer in terms of what makes a healthy community.
I think social engagement, opportunities for people not to be isolated, things that'll draw people out of their house, places to gather, if outdoors. I think the Lions pavilions in communities have been a great asset in the past year. And those kind of sneaky ways to make the healthy choice the easy choice. If you do live in a town, if that town's walkable, maybe it's actually easier to take your shoes than your car, or there's shade trees along the sidewalk, so maybe you don't have to worry about the sunscreen as much every day. Just all those things that a well-built community can help people be healthy without them even trying.
That's great. Thank you for that. I really like the comment on social engagement, particularly over this last year and a bit. And I don't know, but it's probably fair to say, Laura, that issues of mental health, and I know the research that a colleague of mine has been leading, Leith Deacon, brings focus to that in terms of people not feeling as healthy from a mental perspective as historically and in the past. So that's a great example to bring focus to that.
And to add to that, since this is a rural, I know I was so grateful last year and this year to live in a rural community where we have so much space. Like probably everybody can be outdoors and be further than 2 meters apart.
Yeah.
It's just it's been a real blessing to be in a rural community over the past year and to have access to these green spaces.
Yeah, we were saying just before the calls, the session started that I mean, we're fortunate in here, and the numbers of we've avoided these spikes that are happening elsewhere in the province, and certainly our space is a part of that, I would think. Thank you for that, George or Regan.
I can jump in. I want to echo everything Laura said about the social engagement and having things to do, and maybe that's reflected by dynamicism or things changing or having that acceptance for change, and that builds in resilience, whether that be getting out and walking around your town to see what's changed or what's new, but also different value-added production methods that maybe need to happen on agricultural properties, or those sorts of things, that the change that comes along with any community is also really key in rural areas.
Good point. Thank you for that. And certainly that acceptance for change is really quite key, isn't it? George?
I think that I want to go back to my comments about Kevin Lynch and Donald Appleyard. And I think that a healthy community is one that can find its pathways, collective pathways through it, can map its boundaries between residential and areas of significance to it, as focal points, as identity marks that clearly signify the community. You know, I'm thinking of, about a week ago, I went out for a walk in Caledonia along the Grand River, and the Rotary Club had created a pedestrian trail which was substantially long along the riverbank from Caledonia to York. And what struck me was I saw so many people out there enjoying themselves. You know, we cannot, we have to social distance, but you know, on a trail like that in the open space, it's possible to social distance and also acknowledge each other's presence. And that particular trail creates a kind of an identification for the community that uses it. And that being able to differentiate your space in that fashion, where it becomes problematic is where you have the trail went along the river, and then you step to the north about a kilometer, and then you could follow a rail trail back to a trail and then reconnect to where your car was parked along the river. The difficulty is that you had two pedestrian pathways along the river and along the rail trail, but the connecting links were along a county road. And I think that perhaps urban municipalities have done a better job in a sense of creating more shared spaces on streets than rural communities, and it's something for rural communities to think about. We need to think about our county roads and streets in our hamlets and small towns as shared space. Certainly is a problem here in Port Colborne. It gets overcome occasionally when you have, say, canal days, where everybody comes to Port Colborne to celebrate along West Street, which parallels the canal. But that's a kind of thing. Those things are elements of healthy communities, events like that and shared space.
Great, thank you for that, George. One of these days, I'll have to get you up to Huron County, George, and introduce you to the G2G Trail from Guelph to Goderich, which is a pretty amazing local initiative that I think is fantastic. I'm going to pose another question for the panel, and maybe if Jay or Leslie would be willing and available, just monitor the chat box. If there's any questions coming in there that we can address, if any members of our audience, I think we could do that. We can share those questions with the panel as well. I did see, quickly went across my screen, I think Peter Smith had shared a link to the Syrian dinner, which people will be interested perhaps in having a look at. So let me pose my second question, which is a pretty straightforward question. Healthy rural community, or healthy communities rather, are often thought about in an urban context. Why do we need a rural lens brought to this? And maybe after we've had a chance to discuss this question, if Jay or Leslie are able to monitor the chat box, we can see if there's any questions there. Who'd like to jump in that, why we need a rural lens?
I can give it a start. I think I'm pretty early on in my career, so these are some pretty, I don't know, foundational ideas I have, and maybe everyone else can build on and refine kind of what I've said. But from a very fundamental standpoint, I think rural areas are different in terms of most of the land in Canada or in Ontario is rural, and it's very different in terms of population, in terms of land use than other communities. So of course it makes sense that we have to understand and work with these communities in a different way. And then my only other thought around this is they're different in how they're experiencing different phenomena. The recent COVID-19 as an example, where people returning to rural areas, I think is something that's really a strong trend in other places in the world and is also present here in Ontario, and the effects that will have in terms of when a population is so much smaller than in an urban area, the way that impacts or causes change is much more significant than in a place where population is larger.
That's a really interesting point, that the scale of the community makes it easier to, in many ways, do some really positive things. Laura or George?
I'd say, I know when I look at resources available, it always kind of, in a rural area, whether it's perception or reality, I always feel like we're maybe not as well resourced as some of our urban counterparts. So when I see resources come out that, oh, I can, instead of, you know, reinventing the wheel, I can just take what this urban community has done and try to do it here, but it just doesn't work because the context is so different. So I'm always very grateful for organizations that take a rural focus to these issues, because I mean, you can say, you know, you go to one community, you've been to one community, but there are some things that do tie rural communities together that we can help learn from. But, you know, like drinking and driving, we just don't have public transportation here. You know, that's not the solution to our problem around here. And there's all sorts of, you get into specific issues and they'll all have very specific examples of why an urban solution doesn't work in a rural area. So I'm always very grateful to organizations like Gateway, and I know I've seen other jurisdictions, like on a provincial level, seem to focus more on rural solutions than I feel like maybe are available in Ontario, where sometimes it does feel a little bit more urban focused. But yeah, the solutions are just different.
Those are really good points. And I think the approach to drinking and driving is a really good example of that in terms of rural versus urban. I'm reflecting on work that the Rural Intermunicipal Association did and that the County of Huron has done as well with this notion of a rural lens, which I think is really important as we bring focus to this topic too. What does a rural lens tell us about how we deal with health outcomes in terms of rural communities? George, anything you'd like to add to this question?
I'm listening because I have the same questions the other speakers have raised in mind. I think it is difficult, and you know, what I've seen happen that strike me as healthy is more related to my work in Aboriginal communities in Northwestern Ontario, where the culture is the focal point. And I think that if one begins to work on that, reinvigorating it and reappropriating it, that may be a way to deal with it. Certainly in the Midwestern states, I've heard people that do work in community development suggest that the cultural side becomes a really important component to kind of recreating a kind of a setting where we can really think about reusing our spaces, built environment and otherwise, in a way that reconnects people and begins to build into it some of the social helps, if you like, that deal with issues like walking, more physical activity and things of that nature. That's why things like canal days in Port Colborne become really important, because it becomes an event that everybody can participate in. And that's why open air food markets, farm garden markets are so really crucial, because they create a kind of an ability for people to interact and the like.
Great. I really appreciate, George, you bring focus to Indigenous communities as part of that answer. I see we have Jay on the line here, so perhaps we have some questions, and if not, we can come back to some more examples that our panelists might be able to share from their experience. But Jay?
Yeah, so just a couple of questions from our attendees. Chris Lee, one of the champion of the G2G rail trail, asked the question as an attendee today. He said during the preamble that you, Wayne, and he's paraphrasing, that we want to leave at least as much for our children as we have for ourselves. And so we do poorly in differentiating what we want and need and arriving at a consensus. So the question, should we not first ensure to leave to our children as much as they need? And need should be defined and established as a metric to give appropriate priority and action. So how does the report that you were talking about, Wayne, how does the report address need?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Much of my thinking in this is, I have to say, is influenced by the work that was done by David Crombie and the Toronto Waterfront Regeneration Trust, and George will be familiar with all this work. It was back into the early 1990s, I think, George, and the work in terms of defining sustainability. It's fair to say, in my view, that actually our children need more than we have, and I don't mean it in the sense of commercial commodities, but more in the sense of healthier environment, cleaner space, better water. Boy, we've got to, I look at COVID and how tragic that has been. We're just touching the surface when it comes to climate change and these kinds of things, right? And we need to get certainly beyond that. So I don't know, Jay, if I answered Chris's question there or not, but it's certainly an important thing to be thinking about, because I think need is a really relative term. It's not about the latest gadget, right? It's about better environment, cleaner air, better jobs. And I mean that in the sense of healthier jobs too. It's about healthy rural communities. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that, but
I think that's a very good answer. I hope Chris is happy with that. But we have 5 minutes left, and so there's one more question from an attendee that I think is a really good wrap-up question to get a sort of a 1-minute summary from all our panelists here, and that is from Dan Stringer, one of Gateway's board members. It is, if you have time to discuss the thoughts, this is the time, on the future impacts on rural communities as a result of the COVID pandemic, positive or negative. What are the future impacts on rural communities going to be?
Why don't I let the panelists go with that question to start with? Who'd like to jump in on it?
I guess I'm still concerned with housing prices at the moment. I bought my house for $140,000. I'm sure I could make a pretty penny, but where would I go live after that? So it seems like there's more interest anecdotally, or maybe that has been shown in the numbers of people wanting to migrate from the urban area to the rural area. And that was always, I think a migration pattern for retired people from urban areas to come out and move out to some of our lakeshore communities. So yeah, concern about housing affordability, multiple different types of housing types in rural communities, which, that's been a huge concern in urban environments for a long time, and now it's just spreading everywhere, I think. So hopefully I can just stay in Blythe forever because I can afford to pay here, but we'll see.
Depends how much promotion we give it today, right, Laura? Regan and George?
I'd be more worried about social institutions in the rural area, churches, places of worship. Will they reopen after years being closed, more or less? I think of commercial uses in small towns and the effect of delivery vans and Amazon and all those sorts of things. So the commercial structure of our communities is going to change as a result of that. But I think what it does is it accelerates some of the technological innovations that are taking place, autonomous vehicles. One thing we haven't talked about is 3D printing and the effect on the construction industry. So I think there are a whole series of different changes there that are being accelerated because of the pandemic. And the longer it takes, they all kind of kick in. So I think it becomes one situation where we have to watch very carefully how we come out of the pandemic, and there's also the question of trauma. For those who have experienced the illness, there seems to be continuing effects. And those traumas, particularly when you look at, say, adolescent children who have lost a parent, that becomes something to think about. And it's not something that we'll deal with quickly just because we're all vaccinated. It'll be that those kinds of issues will be with us for some time.
Thank you. Regan, a quick response?
Yeah, I see we have a minute, so I'll keep it really quick. I guess I'd be interested from a planning standpoint how this will change kind of conversations about where people will be living and how to plan communities, because this has some pretty major repercussions for kind of dominant discussions in planning and thinking about how we develop communities or how we develop sustainably for the population growth that we're predicted to have.
My quick 10%, 10-second response is, am I more positive because of COVID as it relates to the future rural communities, or less positive? I'm more positive. I think that, you know, there's a recognition of the space that was talked about earlier as being an important contributor. What it means in terms of population projections, what it means in terms of opportunity, those are still questions I think to be answered. But I come away thinking that, you know, there's something about rural communities that are particularly resilient in the context of COVID relative to urban communities that probably is positive for the future. So with that, I'm going to say thanks to my panelists really quickly. Fantastic on the part of all of you. And I know Glenn would have been with us if he could have been. He had a council meeting, so obviously some delay there. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jay.
Right. Well, great. Yeah, thank you, Wayne. Thank you to all our panelists, and thank you to our attendees. Also, I want to thank our sponsors, which are in my background. And I'm not sure, is that a reverse image to you, or is that readable?
It's good.
It's good. Okay.
Not our Bruce, it's Bruce Power. So
okay. So yeah. So thank you to Bruce Power and IDA, and CIBC Wealth Management, and Larry Otten Auto. This webinar being free, it's thanks to our sponsors. So we hopefully continue to be free and providing this service to our community. And you're right, Wayne, I think we have a lot to be proud of in our rural community. If the housing prices are any reflection of it, people want to be here and people are moving here, and still a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds, but I do think it's bright. I agree with you. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And I hope to see more of our attendees back for our next session the first Tuesday of the month in May. All right. Thank you.
thank you all.